Hi, everyone, and welcome to the Information Bottleneck podcast, the podcast that squeezes out the relevant information. And today we have a very special guest, Aran Nayebi. He's assistant professor at Carnegie Mellon University, CMU. So nice to meet you.
Nice to meet you. Thanks for having me on.
And as always, we have Ellen. Hey,
Always happy to be here.
and as always, we start with some news from the recent week. So I think like the main thing that happened this week was the Intel Nvidia agreement. Intel basically will get Nvidia will buy I think it was 5 billion stock from Intel, and it will have some shared collaboration, and they will do some strategic partnership, Intel and Nvidia. And of course, like the Intel stock price went up by kind of 30%, something like that. It was crazy. And I think this is very interesting because as we talked about it before, right? Both me and Ellen, like we worked at Intel, and Intel tried for a long time to go and to develop GPUs and all these things for the deep learning area. But still now, like they just didn't success to do it. And I think it's not clear, I must say, that these partnerships actually helps to Intel to make it. At the end, I don't know. I think like they need to have very how to say, a lot of luck if they want to actually make it again as they did it in the CPUs.
Yeah. I'll say a few things. This is also coming off of the heels of the US government buying 10% of Intel as well. So Intel is being, I would say, a little bit like slice and dice. Ultimately, Intel was even like I think Ravid, you agreed with me last time. It was kind of a dying company. At least it felt that way when we worked there, almost a decade ago. And I'll also quote, I think it was an ex-Intel CEO who said this, you know, the whole silicon industry is a game of Russian roulette where you load the gun and find out if you lost 5 years later. And the kind of long-term decision-making and gambles that get played when dealing with anywhere near 7 nanometer or lower kind of lithography. Basically, a lot of why you'll see these kind of actions to kind of keep Intel alive are, in my opinion, on the grounds of national security. The idea that the US needs to maintain a domestic capability for manufacturing. I'll also point out that Intel, like Oracle, I think Intel might be a little less of this than Oracle. I don't know who's more, but Intel's other major location for huge fabs that were producing like like Xeons and i7s, for example, beyond Oregon, where I live, Hillsboro, Silicon Valley area, Silicon Forest, as they call it, was Israel, right? And I don't know which city that is, but that's the two major fab locations where your CPU probably came from. So I always kind of chuckle at this when I think about, geopolitical implications of decisions like that, right? Even to the point where I wouldn't be surprised if Israel's more domestic tech sector made purchases, because I'll say one last thing. Intel stock, it might have gone up 30%, but that's still from a rock bottom. When I was there, it was sitting at like $50, sometimes $60, and now we're at 20 something, right? So they have a ways to go.
Yeah, I wonder if based on your guys' experience though, like what you felt was preventing Intel, say a decade ago, from really going in the GPU direction, especially being like the king of the CPU era for so long, like what you felt were like failure modes there that may have prevented that. I think it's just an interesting kind of reason to try to unpack that a little bit.
Yeah, I think so. Correct me if I'm wrong, but like at least in my opinion, it was so already in like I don't know 2015. Intel, everyone or at least the leadership at Intel understood it. Like, yeah, deep learning is the next thing, amazing thing that we should do, and like we will not miss this revolution as we missed the mobile revolution. Like this is they always try to say it again and again, and they missed it, right? And I think the story is the same story in every like corporate that is here long enough, right? Like it's not clear like you have a lot of mid-level managers, and there is a big gap between the people that actually make the decisions and people that are working on it. I don't know. I remember like everyone told the leadership they need to create GPUs, and they need to create it with very good software stack, like that the CUDA implementations, and this is the main thing that NVIDIA is good in. And it just didn't happen. Like there were a lot of companies at Intel, but no one actually succeed to integrate it in the Intel's products.
It seems like there was like a first mover advantage they could have taken here, or I mean, like, at least that NVIDIA had, right? Where, they were pretty gun-ho about GPUs from the get-go. And so they probably were developing that stack for a long time and optimizing it to be able to, like in other words, like one thing I often wonder about when it comes to the AI race, right? And kind of relating, I know it's kind of a bad analogy to relate to the nuclear arms race, but one of the big deterrents is, of course, it's just so hard to enrich radioactive materials, and it's so hard to like go and assemble a nuclear weapon, like just the knowledge you need to have, et cetera, for that. And I'm just not certain how like how specialized is it to like make a GPU versus if you already are very good at making a CPU? You know what I mean? Like, was the delta so large, or was it really mainly a management thing?
Well, I'll chime in a little bit. I mean, first of all, you have to understand that Ravid and there's two Intels, right? There's the fab itself, the people who wear what they refer to as bunny suits, and do that work. And then there's us who sit in cubicles, and maybe even three if you count the data centers that were attached to people who live in the data centers with the loud fans and all of that. And so I would say that the Gaudi chips, which are out right now, are really comparable to like H100s in terms of peak flops, maybe slightly worse in terms of total like total value or something, even when used at 100% utilization. But Intel also had things like the math kernel library, 1DAL API, and deep extensions into x86. That meant that for them, in my opinion, it was too little too late. Like they needed to have been going deep into these Gaudi style GPUs for data centers at the time when they were buying a bunch of milquetoast AI companies such as Nirvana, and there was like another one that they bought. Also, I'll say one other thing. Look, I know maybe on the balance sheet it didn't make sense, but Intel's Optane DC, that thing they did with Micron, 3D Point, is still really awesome tech and way faster than SSDs at that era. So Intel's always had like really random places where they've been really good at and haven't, I claim they actually were excellent of a choice for AI, especially AI on the CPU, like accelerating a lot of workloads that later got moved to GPU at great pain, but could have been accelerated with basically just a couple lines of code. They did that way better than AMD did. And so I find it especially remarkable that they failed in the GPU side, like right at this moment. A lot of it being that you can't rent a Gaudi GPU unless you work for Intel, right? Like there's nobody that has them to rent for. So they didn't even get it to market properly. And again, this is in spite of being only a little bit behind NVIDIA's current flagship. So I think that that's, in some ways they did the thing, right, of producing the GPU. And I find that remarkable.
But this is the same story with mobile devices, right? Like it's the same story. And again, you don't know. I don't think like maybe in retrospective you can say, oh, maybe this little thing or this little thing like was really impactful in why they didn't make it. But it's really hard to understand why it's happening. And I think like at the end, this is a lot about processes, like how to make good processes, like to understand in real time, like when something doesn't work, right? But it's hard. It's hard to do it, especially if you have like a 40 years old company or even more, right?
Oh, I wonder also if the fact that like NVIDIA has been at this since for so long and has been the clear leader, that maybe that perhaps, I don't know, discouraged them, though I don't know if that's a really good argument there, right? Given that they're a behemoth.
Yeah, I was going to say Intel's been making iGPUs for almost as long or maybe longer than Nvidia's been making. So in that sense, especially because Nvidia for a long time made most of their money in the consumer market and even mobile at times, right? So for a while there, Intel and Nvidia were very comparable. Sorry, I'm just trying to like point out that the time frame kind of thing is it's more around a time frame of when they were putting intentionality and huge amounts of resources. And this gets to things like talent. So for example, Intel's always paid a little below, maybe quite a bit below FANG, depending on when the era was. And worse yet, Intel also would have, whole buildings get laid off because there was so much bloat, sometimes political kind of empire building of like some of those middle managers hiring people who into basically roles with no real mandate. I saw everything there. And I'll point out one last thing, which is that there has been extreme amounts of effort, really in a lot of the tech industry, but things kind of, I don't mean to go too political, but what I'll say is that Intel, of all the companies that might have hired in ways that weren't based on raw like decision of if somebody was talented or not for various reasons, Intel was up there. And it's especially problematic because when people get hired at companies that are known to engage in policies like this, especially if they're part of groups who might be considered desirable for various reasons, they start questioning themselves and being like, am I here because I was skilled enough, or am I here for some other reason? And so that I think is hurtful also kind of because I had colleagues who have literally expressed this as an externalization of their own imposter syndrome. And so I think that Intel had serious like rot in the talent level, even to the point where I would say that the abuse of like the H-1B system that is definitely being completely eliminated with a hammer, destroying it, right now, was probably happening and contributed in various small ways to kind of Intel's internal decay.
Well, do we think the H-1B thing is going to stick? Actually, I mean, and this is gonna affect FANG, everybody. I mean, academia, if it
especially in
sticks.
academia, right?
Yeah.
Like Microsoft and Amazon will get over it, right? They will find ways like L1 and all these types of visas, but academia, this is like there are so many researchers, right? Like new hiring new professors that are coming on H1Bs.
Yeah, and I have students who like genuinely cannot
Students.
go internationally right now for a conference. Like, I mean, we can do domestic conferences, so it's okay. But outside, luckily, NeurIPS is in San Diego. I mean, you know how they had like, what is it, San Diego and Mexico City, and maybe one other location for NeurIPS. I'm blanking now, but it's clear what the decision is like for them. Yeah.
3 locations and not enough space for papers, right?
Yeah. What do you think about the NeurIPS submission and the NeurIPS reviews? Do we want to talk about it?
Well, it's certainly an interesting time, right? I mean, like we now have LLMs that generate lots of text. And so certainly at the like abstract submission phase, there's not only lots of placeholder abstracts, but like just clearly like garbage submissions. But then, at the same time, reviewers are using them and it's like this, right? It's just like, it's unclear how effective these things are for like really truly doing what they were supposed to do, which is to sort out good quality research from bad quality research. And I think it's a time of transition, so like there's lots of noise that's going on. But I do feel the whole like, if a paper is good quality, like if it's been scored well, to reject it because of space considerations, I feel like there should be like an intermediary option of like we maybe have a cutoff for like papers to get actually presented, just as like they have like cutoffs for spotlight and oral. There should be like this third, instead of like just admit or not, it's like like allowed to, or like, I mean, I don't know, like poster or not, basically. And then it's still like published in the proceedings and accepted if it's high enough. Yeah, but not just like totally rejected after, like, because the rebuttal thing is so much effort and all that, just to reject it even though they succeeded, is hard. But I don't know the only solution, but it's just one thing that's just off the top of my head.
Just for who of us that don't know, so this week were the NeurIPS results, and apparently there were a lot of papers that got really high scores and didn't get in because the senior editors were rejected them, and because they didn't have enough space. It was pretty like a lot of people claim that how it can be, right? Like we got good reviews, like the people behind, like above the reviewers get us in, and then someone reject us because there is no space. So it just randomly reject us. So I think it was there was a lot of frustrations for people, and I must say that, like, in my opinion, the problem is the submission that we just don't have good enough reviewers for so many papers. I think like we need to constrain and we need to reduce the number of submissions. And all of us know, right? Like people are submitting a lot of papers that are not good enough, but they're somewhere like, they're fine, right? They're not really bad and they're not really good, but there's something fine. But 3 more months, it will be much better if you keep working on it. And I think these papers, we actually want to wait till the next deadline. And there are many ways to do it. Like you can limit the number of papers that each author will submit. You can enforce that your that the number of papers that you are doing reviews is proportional to the number of papers you submit. You can take some fees for each submission. I don't know what will work, but I think we should try it. That in this way we can reduce the number of papers, and then the reviews will be much more high quality, and then we can really take into account these reviews, and we don't need all the higher level people that we will decide based on nothing.
Also did hear though that like some of the people who did review this year have like expressed the feeling that they don't feel like their reviewing was like worthwhile, or like as a like in other words, it's like, and I don't know, I'm sure that's exacerbated by the number of papers, but it's like it's a question of like there's also like reviewer morale. So like in other words, it's hard to get high quality reviewers to begin with as another issue. I will say though, like for this year, like I was actually quite surprised that we got like not only good reviews but like thoughtful reviewers who actually like read the paper, which can happen. But I like when it does happen, you're like, wow, like this is what peer reviewers for. Like, this is great. It actually improved the paper. But I think there's just also this feeling that's awesome when the reviewer expertise like lines up with the paper and you just can improve things. But like in general, that's not always the case. And if the reviewers also aren't feeling like they're able to, if they feel like what they're doing isn't a meaningful contribution, then that's another incentive structure to kind of look into.
Yeah, and I don't know. I think both of you two as academics are very much like coming at this from the idea that the kind of 22 or whatever % acceptance rate needs to stay the same, and that that the industry kind of conferences should stay very ultra selective, and maybe that is the case, right? But I think that if you start reducing the increasing the acceptance rate 1, 2, 3 percentage points, then you're adding in potentially hundreds or even thousands of papers. And I first of all, you can start looking at variances in acceptance rates across all the years for given conferences. Then you can start looking at that across the industry. If you look, I mean, sure, something like NeurIPS has 3x or whatever average number of citations that ACL does. I think ACL's been pulling up its averages recently, so it might not be as extreme. It might be much closer. But certainly, if you would compare, NeurIPS to like EM&LP, it's going to be an extreme amount. But if you look at acceptance rates, some years, I bet you that some of those conferences were like NeurIPS might have been slightly higher, and certainly in various tracks of NeurIPS, right? And I think this also gets to a few other problems, right? Like that high school track, I don't know if that's still going, but the first year that did, I think that robbed kids out of the ability to get their credit because they both had a lower acceptance rate in the high school track than the main conference, and they didn't get a published like archival version. So it was like the worst of all possible worlds. I just think that there should be alignment between acceptance rates clearly and H indexes. And if that's not very like 1-to-1, then I think the idea of just simply letting in a few more 100 papers, like being okay with 24% this year, should have been on the table, in particular to avoid the situations of all accepts, maybe one weak accept, reject because of space when the AC said accept. Like, that's especially heartbreaking, right? And if it was
Yeah.
1% difference to save all those papers, why not do it, right? But they say physical space, and so that's something where taking money in or like raising fees for registration. I actually don't think that registration fees are that prohibitive for most people. I think that there's a ton of money these days in NeurIPS in particular, so I think money is the way to go to fix that problem.
Yeah, I agree. I also think that like one other option is to go to the TMLR path, right? That you have very like short but not like a whole year round review process, and from some time to time you can make these conferences, right? And you can put the papers and the posters in one place, but the review process is much more, people are doing the papers that they know something about it and they are quite of experts, and it's more like they can go and talk with and like try to the engage with the authors, and the whole process is much more relaxed and constructive in some way.
Yeah, and
But
I also feel that like it's a question of like, like regard to H indexes and things like this. So it's like, like what is the purpose of peer review? In some sense, like if a paper is interesting or important enough, it'll just get reviewed informally by people trying it out and like putting out the code and seeing, like, otherwise, if it's not important enough, no one's going to read it anyway. And so the main reason for peer review is, of course, like I think a lot of ways, not so much quality control, which of course it acts as some filter, but more so for junior students or people who are less, have less of the resources or less well known, to like be able to enter a venue or be part of a venue purely on the basis of the merit of their work, ideally the whole thing. But because there's a lot of senior researchers who just like put something on archive, and then in fact that becomes like their most cited paper and it was never published, right? So there's lots of, I mean, like RMS prop was just a slide from like Jeff Hinton, right? But at the same time, it's like he's already known, or like a lot of these folks are already known because they were publishing, right? And so I don't think the answer is like, it's definitely not, I mean, I've heard the answer of like, oh, like we should just not have conferences because like what's the point? And like there's archive. Like I think there's like a social aspect to it, and it's good for like junior researchers more so than maybe more senior folks. But I mean, the journals I think are a good option that you're mentioning in terms of getting better quality things. Because like I'll say, is like the other field I intersect with, which is neuroscience. It's often viewed like, in computational neuroscience, it's like, it's totally fine. But like in real like experimental neuroscience, it's like, the view is that like NeurIPS isn't even a publication. So it's like, they don't consider it unless it's like actually in a journal. So like in neuroscience, a journal carries a lot more weight, which obviously leads to its own issues of gatekeeping and things like that about like Nature, which aren't, et cetera, Nature Cell, and just the other kind of prominent Neuron, for example, is another one. And so obviously the extreme direction isn't great either, but like the other extreme maybe isn't. So somewhere in the middle is probably the answer, where you have a reasonable regard for journals, not total disregard, and as an alternative path. And we still keep around conferences to an extent, but have some more regulation there.
Yeah, I agree. Okay, I think like we should move to talk about your research and why and what you're doing actually in your day-to-day life. I think this is a great point. So yeah, you're doing computational neuroscience and machine learning and a lot of other stuff, but maybe we start with some of like your recent works about how to make models that in some sense mimic animals, right, and has some intrinsic drive to explore, and how can you actually implement it?
Yeah. So maybe I'll start also as a little bit of like a high level motivation for this, just to give it some context. So like the basic approach here is one to like use engineering to answer a scientific question, and like take intelligence, the science or the study of intelligence, from purely being about building better systems, which obviously is important, but to also trying to like understand how it's instantiated in brains and in biology and across species. And so like to really kind of turn that into more of a systematic science of intelligence than purely an engineering of intelligence. And so where I see the intersection with neuroscience isn't like, I think, for example, like the hope was since the beginning of neuroscience was you would stare at a brain and you do recordings, you do certain manipulations, and out comes an answer about how this remarkable thing we call cognition and our first person experience arises, right? And I would say that, in fact, it's been far more challenging, right? The brain is noisy, our experimental tools are often very limited in terms of number of neurons we can record, et cetera. And it's actually been easier to do the other thing, which is to try to build intelligence and then just be confronted with basically the similar sets of problems that the evolution had to figure out to create a brain. And to give us these kinds of like substrate independent invariances, which I'll mention in just a second, that maybe are more fundamental than the particulars of like what ion channel is being lit up where and what exact circuit is doing some particular restricted computation, and really more look at the brain as a whole.
But what is the question? Like, so is the question is like, okay, now I have the brain and I don't understand anything about the brain. I can try to understand some high level behaviors of animals. And now I want to try to implement it or like the same behavior in machine learning, or you actually want to understand like how these animals actually behave. So what are the important questions here?
Yeah. Great. Yeah. So it's actually both. But really what we're motivated by are like, what are the things in current AI that animals and brains currently do well that we want to try to like get inspiration from what the brain does as targets, as engineering targets. And then by process of optimization and getting those things to work better, can we also make a statement about the internals of the brain too in more detail? So use behavior as goals to build agents for, and then compare the internals back and see like, do we actually get a better understanding of the constraints, the evolutionary constraints the brain had to do to solve a similar problem by mapping the internals of the model to the brain. And so what are these goals? Well, like the goals in general are, well, I think the next frontier isn't so much pre-training, right? So scale, I would say, for example, like scale has proven very effective, but hasn't gotten us all the way there. And in particular, you can view the pre-training stage as like effectively doing a type of in silico evolution, right? The brain itself was evolved over the course of, billions of years. And it's actually required a lot of energy to get there. What we're doing with backprop is actually a very directed form of that kind of evolution and like getting us quickly within our lifespans to some kind of adult state, basically. And the things that remain, though, are things like related to modeling the world still, or like interaction, embodied interaction, continual learning, that sort of things. In other words, getting agents that are lifelong learners, ultimately, and trying to understand, is there a kind of general purpose agent architecture that works well, that clearly lots of different brains are implementing to some extent. And that's, I think, at least our interests, like my interests at a high level of like, these are the kinds of goals we want our systems to be able to solve. World modeling, memory, autonomy, lifelong learning that brains can do well, and that we're just trying to get our agents to do. And then ask, like, are we actually solving it in a way that the brain does it as a byproduct of working on the same hard problem?
And in general, do you think it is because there are so many ways to solve a problem, right? So in general, do you think we will see this alignment between how humans and AI work, even if they solve the same problem?
Yeah. So I think yes, but with caveats. So in other words, like it depends on the types of problems you want to solve. So oftentimes if you take hard problems, so like, for example, problems, say in vision, for example, as a canonical case, it actually turned out that when you optimize neural networks or CNNs for tasks, they actually got representations that were the best predictive models of visual cortex that we ever have, actually, since. And there was some loose inspiration, by the way, from neuroscience at the time, but it was still like a lot of those features were hand coded. So how to go from that to a real behavior, like say object recognition, was unclear. And like really learning and optimizing for that, adding the evolutionary part as well, the optimization part was quite critical. And it was interesting that as a byproduct, you got back like V1, V4 in IT through end-to-end optimization. And so maybe the deeper principle, and sort of like in my own PhD, the work was to show that this principle didn't just hold in primate visual cortex, but was more broadly. You could apply it to rodents, you could apply it to higher brain areas like navigation or world modeling, like mental simulation. And it just kind of turned out that as you just solved the harder, more ethologically variable task, more ethologically relevant, you converge on representations that were highly predictive of the brain. Not perfectly, but much better than anything that came before it. And the underlying principle is called the contravariance hypothesis. So this is a term put forth by Rosa Chow and Danny Amons at Stanford, where the basic idea is just that, like, as you're trying to solve a harder problem, just in general, there's fewer solutions to those very, very hard problems that you just, with high probability, converge on with some overlap to the same problem that the brain had to solve, basically the same representation the brain had to solve by trying to work in that same direction of hard problems. And I think the AI version of this is the Platonic representation hypothesis as well. Like, they're all related, basically.
I'm so glad you brought that up. That's been sitting in my mind the whole time. Like, doesn't this? Yeah, I'd love to hear, just please go deeper into your opinions on that, because I think that's controversial. Specifically, I did like a minor in philosophy, so I care a lot about this for its philosophical.
First explain what it is, right? What is it? And then say what you think about it.
Yeah, so I mean, it's at a very high level. It's the hypothesis that, all these models are basically converging on very similar representations. It doesn't actually say anything about the brain, by the way. It's purely the Platonic representation hypothesis, to be clear, is purely about model-to-model representations converging. But the contravariance principle is just saying that this is all actually related because it's the same thing. And one of the underlying reasons why the neural networks we optimize are matching the brain so well. But I will say it's not like, I think it's a very important principle to articulate. I will say that in practice that, like, one, the overlap isn't 100%. And two, it's not like one model is always the best. It's sort of like groups of model families that end up not only converging with one another, but also having representations that converge with that of the brain. So to give an example of this, right, in primate visual cortex, you can show that when contrastive self-supervised learning came out, so for just to like go back a little bit, for a long time, getting self-supervised learning to work was very hard. So we had ideas like autoencoding; they didn't really work that well, GAMs, etc. And then you had contrastive learning that came out in 2019 or so, 2018 even, and you ended up actually getting very effective representations for how to do things in an unsupervised way. It also turned out that those unsupervised methods were also the best predictors of primate visual cortex without training on category labels. So in other words, like before, when we got good vision models, we had to train on ImageNet with a categorization with supervision. And that was kind of obviously, it was just a proxy for some kind of unsupervised method that the brain does, because like obviously you and I don't get rich labels written in the sky for us, but it was just a proxy. It was just an ethologically relevant proxy to force the things to do the right task. And it turned out that actually, once you got contrastive self-supervised learning, you are starting to get models that were actually equal in representational predictive power as the categorization models, whereas the prior methods like autoencoding, et cetera, that didn't work as well, weren't quite good. They were okay for V1, but like for the later ventral visual areas, they weren't. So that's an example of like working on a hard problem that's ethologically relevant, e.g. learning without labels, which is what animals and humans do. And then when a breakthrough happens, it actually does lead to this like improved convergence with the brain.
But so it can be a possibility that, I don't know, for example, in DNA, right? Like we're basically like 99% monkeys, right? Or like share the same amount of DNA with monkeys. And still, like the differences are very, very important, right? All of us know that we are like very different in the day-to-day life from monkeys, right? So do you think we have the tool and we have the metrics to understand the differences, or like even to quantify what are the differences between representations of machines and representations of
Yeah, that's a great question, a very deep one. I would say that it seems like our best path forward to addressing this is by building these computational models and comparing them to various brains. So to give an example with the contrastive loss, I had work that came out just around the same time. I was working in that lab in Danny Amons' group that did the primate, the self-supervised one. but that was led by someone else, Changqi Zhuang, who's now actually in the superintelligence team at Meta. Work we had was actually showing that the same loss function of this contrastive objective also well predicts or best predicts mouse visual cortex. So the Allen Institute had just collected a bunch of recordings from both V1 but also higher visual areas across mouse visual cortex just a year and a half prior. And none of the categorization optimized networks were predicting that visual cortex data well like it did in primates. And this is for several reasons. One is like the brain of mouse is like very non-hierarchical. It's like V1 here and then all these like higher areas in parallel. Whereas like, in just to do a very coarse approximation, primate visual cortex is highly hierarchical. Of course, there's some caveats to that, but it's far more hierarchical than mouse. And it turned out that actually like, okay, you could say, after the fact, like, well, of course, mice don't categorize, right? So it's like, why would that be a good objective? And it turned out that actually like what was good was the same self-supervised objective. So same contrastive objective as in the primates, but with a shallower network operating with lower visual acuity. So this made you a worse categorizer, but the self-supervised methods were still better they're still functional subject to these constraints of a shallower cortex and lower visual acuity compared to the other self-supervised methods. So you still needed contrastive learning, but they were also just like kind of more spread out across the types of tasks they could do. So in other words, like they weren't the best categorizers, but they were like also quite reasonably good at like other things like texture recognition and pose estimation, et cetera, up to the visual acuity that they were given. So in other words, like mouse visual cortex is just trying to do the best it can with the limited resources it has. And so the similarities between that and primate visual cortex it seems to be, at least for now, the same loss function, same self-supervised objective, but just different like hardware constraints of a shallower architecture and lower visual acuity. So it's like, I wouldn't know that by looking at a brain and like looking at the vector of responses. I would have to actually go and systematically compare models. And also we would need advances in AI to like even have good self-supervised learning, because the project wouldn't have worked anyway without it.
What do you think of unsupervised learning? By extension, I've heard Yann LeCun and others basically say that, humans are not exposed to as much data as LLMs are, throughout their life, to which I've always thought that was not true, because first of all, we have unsupervised learning, clustering, dimensionality reduction, PCA and the like, and they rely on the principle of you have no labels whatsoever, but you can figure out what something is based on seeing it as what it isn't, right? I guess is how I would describe clustering. And then you put a name to the label class that you've discovered later. My argument is that the visual fidelity and audio fidelity, and even however, I don't know how much data smell olfactory data takes up on disk, but it probably takes up a lot at the fidelity of our sensors. My claim is that humans are taking in enough data to be comparable when you account for the claim further that the brain is probably using some combination of all of the ML techniques, unsupervised, self-supervised, even selectively full supervised and semi-supervised, whatever variants. With that in mind, I've always thought that we take in plenty of data to be comparable to today's LLMs. I'm curious if you agree with that. I think I'm totally wrong. What your belief is here?
Yeah, I think we certainly take a lot of data. I think though there's often this comparison between the pre-training stage of the model and how much energy and how much data it takes in and that of the brain, which is its efficiency. And I think that's actually a mistake to compare the two directly, just because there is still a problem, but I'll get to that in a second. But I think the main thing is that I really think of pre-training as like lumping in evolution and development, but mostly it's evolution, effectively like very directed evolution to just get us to a point that's okay. And so I really think of it as like, if you took the amount, so under that measure of pre-training as evolution, if you took the amount of energy and lifetimes it took to like lead to humans, it's massive, right? Much more than what we use today to train models. But I will say that let's say and this is, I think, why we need to shift to an agent-based point of view, because like, if we think of pre-training as evolution and we can initialize our agents to have modular components that are each pre-trained as needed, then the real question becomes like, how do you get those agents to like self-improve and adapt online like their model of the world and all of that, and get better and better. And what should the intrinsic objectives be to guide that improvement? Because the environment doesn't give you dense rewards, right? This is related to Rabi. I know you mentioned the intrinsic curiosity work we had, so maybe it's a segue to that. But at the end of the day, it's like those to me are still the unsolved questions of like the brain. It's not so much the efficiency aspect of it. Actually, I think it's really this online adaptation and like intrinsic motivation aspect that is just like a very much an open question.
And just one more question. Do you think it's different between different modalities, between vision and text? Because, for example, like we have a recent paper about we compare LLMs versus humans, like cognitive experiments. It's like people needed to cluster, like to say what is the distance with some concept, banana and fruits and things like that. And then we build some graph with the distances, and we look on this and we compare it to some representations of LLMs. And in this project, we found that the representation of the LLM, it's much more efficient in the sense that like it contains only like, the information that it needed in order to solve like the problem. And I think this is somehow like it's different than vision, that you can have like at least at the end in vision, this is very let's say physical measurement, right? Like you're walking the world and you see all the things, so you can somehow like you can align this with what the model, like with the input of the model. But in text it's much harder, right? Because text in some sense it's much more compressed input, and this is something that human already like compressed and filter with their brain, if you want.
Yeah, it could also be like we humans also rely on working memory. So like the LM, might not really be using that, but when we're trying to solve this problem, we're also relying on that. And I think that's also an open question of how to like do memory well. I don't think memory is a solved problem for LM agents at this point in time. And it's certainly not as you go scale now to what you're saying, to like video, like real world, like visual input that's just constantly coming at you. You'll easily fill up the context window with that. And so how to filter that out and then use that to guide your reasoning is something we do. I wouldn't necessarily say LLMs do, but they're certainly approximating it to some extent through text. And so that's probably why you see both some similarities and differences in those error patterns, right? I imagine. And so it's an interesting question. But again, it's like, I do think with regards to modalities, though, there probably, at least from comparing it to the brain, that there probably is some evidence that there's shared loss functions still, but maybe just different architectures. So to give you an example of this, so we just had this work accepted in speaking of NeurIPS actually as an oral, which is surprising. I never had an oral as a student, and so I'm grateful my students actually got to experience that. But it was on tactile processing, and so remember how I mentioned in mouse visual cortex, it's like a contrastive objective function that gives rise to vision, the best kind of models of vision for mouse visual cortex, and it's also used in primate, but deeper. In tactile, we're also finding the contrastive objectives are matching the supervised one. So we basically built like a data set where like an ImageNet level data set of like based on like a biomechanical whisker and using that to recognize objects as like a mouse would. And then we trained both recurrent networks that unroll in time, kind of like you see in the brain, highly recurrent networks, and combined them with also like sequence models. So like attention and then a self-supervised loss at the top. And what we found was these did better than, say, SSMs and also feed-forward networks, both at the task, but also at predicting the brain. So in other words, what we're seeing in this other modality is like same contrastive objective is showing up in terms of matching mouse somatosensory cortex and also doing tactile recognition in time, but a different, more recurrent architecture than we saw in vision. So I can imagine loss functions actually being quite similar. In fact, that would be my null hypothesis at this point. It's like probably very similar loss functions, self-supervised objectives. It's probably very powerful, but some differences in architecture. Like if you want to go to olfaction, a lot of what's known about olfaction is actually it's very much randomly wired. So it's like far less structured than vision. And likely we might have different percepts of smells. Each of us, like our conscious experience of a smell might be different in how we would feel it, just given that the wiring can differ so much. But I wouldn't be surprised if it was like a similar self-supervised objective.
I'm quickly just fascinated also by the whole like genetic component, right? I don't have the soap gene that makes cilantro taste like soap, but my mom does, for example. So the idea of like different perception of the same things, and I always had that was like one of my first philosophical questions is like, is my perception of blue the perception that everybody else has? Or, and I find it fascinating that AI starts giving answers, or at the very least evident. Like, for example, and mind you, I do not like Plato. I do not believe, at least don't like the implications of the allegory of the cave being true, right? But like the Platonic representation hypothesis is there, and it's saying, hey, all representations tend towards the same kind of thing. Or specifically in the paper, the claim is that they tend towards a easily alignable representation. So you can quickly align one representation from another. And that's where I just love this, especially too. I think you mentioned things like evolution, and so I was curious what your thoughts are about Moravec's paradox, right? And I assume you're familiar with that, and maybe you could, if you are, maybe you should define it also for the listeners who might not have heard of it.
Yeah. So Moravec's paradox is the thing that, like, the things that are easy for us, like vision and embodied control, like doing this, for lifting this bottle, are very hard, but they're trivial for us. And then the other things that are hard mentally for us, like language and math, are actually much easier to engineer, right? And so it's kind of this inverted pyramid of sorts. And one thing I will say about evolution is actually that there is variability between animal brains. So regarding, like, connecting back to the percepts that you were mentioning, a natural question when we're talking about alignment, variance or Platonic representation hypothesis, what is the alignment to? And one thing we know is that actually, like, brains aren't 100% predictive of one another. So, like, take the same brain area, show it the same stimulus as best as you can. Even amongst the same species, same brain area, same conditions, there's variability. And this is after correcting for stochasticity in the brain as well, as best as you can. So it's like, there's clearly, like, at the level of neural population representations, just differences. But there's usually a high degree of alignment. So in other words, this is kind of this is kind of the basis of our neuro AI training test. For a long time, when we were trying to answer, like, what should the ceiling of good be for model to brain alignment, the answer is it should be up to brain alignment. So in other words, a model should be as good as a brain as brains are to each other under that metric. And so that's our neuro AI training test. So don't just look at this as behavior, but also at the level of the internals. And so it's quite clear, though, that, like, when it comes to Moravec's paradox, that, like, our visual systems have quite stereotyped things that make them align to each other quite well and solve this kind of problem very effectively. Else we wouldn't have evolved. There's, like, strong evolutionary pressure to survive and exist and do useful things. And probably, for example, like, I would say related to this, the mistake of end-to-end RL for the longest time, and one of the reasons why it wasn't really working that well, was that people were learning their visual system on the go through trial and error. And in fact, like, if you compare those RL-based visual systems to mouse visual cortex, for example, they predict the brain less well than self-supervised objectives. And so what does this kind of maybe hint at? And these are RL objectives, by the way, trained end-to-end in a biomechanically realistic animal body to do maze navigation, all kinds of, like try to really strive for ethology as best as we can. And what this is saying is maybe there's a kind of modularization that's happening in the brain. Like, actually, like, this kind of self-supervised pre-training for sensory systems is, like, maybe the unifying objective. And then you kind of want to hold that fixed and then do the other stuff on top, the reasoning and other things that maybe are lighter weight from an evolutionary point of view on top of that. But, like, you kind of want to solve vision as best you can by the time the organism's, like, there.
I have, like, maybe unrelated question. So do you think back in the time that I did my PhD, like, I did it on perceptual learning on mice, and, like, we had maybe 100, 200 cells that, like, we looked on their spikes, and compared to existing, like, data that we have for LLM, like, this is, right, almost zero. Do you think if now you will have, like, if you scale up the data, I don't know how many neurons you have today, but you think this is a main problem? Like, now if you will have, like, 100x more data, you think it will be better to create more better models, but also, like, to predict it better?
Absolutely. So there's there's a kind of line of work that goes that's called like data optimized or response optimized models, which fit directly to the neural data. So a lot of what I talked about was like you optimize for a task, and then by virtue of optimizing for a task, as an eval, the brain becomes an eval set where you're like just checking if the internals actually match the brain all that well. But the response optimized thing is to actually train on brain data, and you can also validate on brain data as well. And we're starting to enter an era where we can do this because we're collecting lots more data on the order of hundreds of thousands of units. But I will say that like I think collecting that data is critical and important for this, and it's like the main thing we need. I don't think that modeling techniques need to be changed. There's some work that like from Eva Dyer's group at showing that like maybe if you make some modifications, this will be important. But I think by and large, it's still transformer-like architecture, but applied to larger and larger brain sets. But I think the other constraint is the types of tasks that we actually get these animals to do. So, right, like a lot of the paradigm of neuroscience has been, I want to answer a very specific, restricted question about cognition that's repeatable and reliable. And that often involves overtraining the animal on a very simple, like take the monkey, like a little reach out task like this or like that. And often what you find, and there's some like very nice work from Peiran Kiao and Surya Gaiguli like 10 years ago showing that if the task itself is quite restricted, the dimensionality of like the intrinsic dimensionality of the neural population response is actually quite low too. So it's like you could go and collect tons and tons of data, but ultimately, if you're not actually getting the animal to do very naturalistic, difficult tasks that it was evolved to literally born to do, you're just not going to get much insight. Basically, you're not going to see as many interesting patterns emerge from whole brain. So like we have this wonderful opportunity, I think, of looking into cognition into the brain right now. And that's just getting better and better. But I think we need to move away as a field, like from the field of neuroscience, from simple tasks to just like, collect lots of brain data from animals doing unconstrained things. And I bet you'll definitely get something that's not only useful for brain machine interfaces, but potentially a good AI model, at least maybe say for robotics or for embodiment. Like let's say hypothetically that all the approaches, which I doubt, by the way, but let's say hypothetically all the approaches in AI to robotics fail. And somehow it's just easier to collect more brain data and just have the animals do it. You can hypothetically learn the solution, right? Without solving it yourself in this manner.
So do you think this is like the future? Like to somehow to record actual neurons, actual spikes from animals that are walking around in the world?
Yes, I think so. And I think especially maybe not in the future of AI, but the future of, say, brain-machine interfaces. So for example, like if you wanted to have an implant for somebody, it's actually going to be very critical that you collect lots of data from that person. In other words, like a lot of medicine is actually not, I mean, there's few things, of course, that are like, that hold across populations, right? Like smoking is bad, alcohol is probably not great, these sorts of things. But like the specific stuff, which is most of it, has to be like tied to that individual and like really like almost overfit to that individual to like make meaningful differences for people. And like one of the reasons for this is that like, people have various genetic variability, etc. And like we need to account for that. And also the brains have particular variability. So like a lot of what I talked about previously was, especially with the neuro AI Turing test, is about like the general principles that are holding across individuals that are robust to that, right? Like how our visual system works, et cetera. But like what I'm talking about here is, for medicine, for brain machine interfaces, those sorts of things, the future will likely be like recording lots of brain data before the implant. And maybe you start with a foundation model and lots of brains, and then you fine tune to that person, for example. But none of that is hypothetical. I think people are doing it now. I mean, I know at Meta, they have the neural band, and their goal there is actually not individualistic. In other words, like it's not to build a band that's like, at least not yet, but that is like tied to the individual, but works across individuals. In other words, that they've like perfected their machine learning such that like I, as a new user, put it on and it just works out of the box.
Okay, I think we did quite a long detour, but maybe do we want to talk about intrinsic behavior and how can you make it?
Yeah,
Intrinsic
no,
motivation.
very interesting question. Yeah. And it's one thing I'm intrinsically motivated by myself by, because like, one of the great successes I mentioned of RL was to, in games like Go and chess, where you had a very well-defined reward function. And one of the challenges has been like, if I don't know if you've seen this video of a baby where it's like there's this kind of like slow like time lapse of a baby in a room with all these toys, and the baby's like playing with the toys with all of them, like it's touching every object in the room, right? And you look at that and you're like, well, what's the goal here? Like, it's not very goal directed in any way. It's just like very exploratory and weird, right? And it's very, very counter to like how we think of things in RL, especially where you're optimizing an objective and you're trying to do really well on a task. And furthermore, it's like, so I mentioned the other issue with RL is, of course, the modularity, which I think is important to scale things, is to not do it end to end, but pre-train and then do some RL on top. But then this other aspect is like, what should the objective even be if we had those, right? And so one natural objective is, of course, surprisal. So like, it takes some cues from information theory and, maybe the baby's maximizing novelty. And certainly to some extent there is that. But one kind of critical difference between a perfectly information maximizing agent and a baby is that if I turn the screen into white noise, the baby is going to grow disinterested after a while. Whereas, of course, from an information theoretic point of view, it's really optimal. Like, I got to pay attention to the white noise until I die, right? It's like the most important thing in the world. And so there's clearly like strong priors that like about these objectives that are just different from what animals and babies deal with, and like what RL agents that are like hyper optimized to do and would die in the real world if they encountered a white noise screen.
Do you think it's just a prior, or like this is very, let's say, you have a lot of factors that you need to take into account, right? One of them is time, right? So like this distribution depends on time, but it's not only that, like, at least as I see it, right? Like, it's not like you have very strong prior and like that in some sense, like it's much stronger than the observation that you have, or like this entropy maximization, but the distribution is actually changing all the time.
Yeah, that's a great question. So there was some work. So kind of in the past, say 5 to 10 years, work that kind of goes beyond surprisal to like tracking progress, for example, like how much are your parameters changing in time, and seeing if you're actually making progress in those shifts. And one of the things that was interesting was that we actually trained RL agents with these embodiments in Majoku, with kind of more animal embodiments, like say a zebrafish, for example, with these objectives. Sometimes they would just like, they wouldn't really learn to swim forward. They would like have very weird ethological things that like for example, like shifting your joint angles in kind of random ways, which of course satisfies the objective, but isn't, it's like reward hacking. It's like, but isn't like really the point. And one thing we found, like kind of the only thing that was to have a prior, like a world model basically, but what I mean of like the expectation of like what it means to move forward in your environment, and compare that to how much, when you're in an unexpected scenario, how much progress you're making towards that disagreement with your world model. And so in other words, it's like and one reason this came up is that like people, when they actually tried out real fish, the nice thing about zebrafish in particular is that you can literally peer inside their brains. So they can create genetic mutants that light up, the entire population lights up as it gets more active, and you can actually image that while it's moving. And they found that if they had the fish be in a VR where, this is the work of Misha Arens and his group at Genile Farm, if they had the fish move through its environment in VR and then cut that signal where its movement no longer affected its actual self-motion, it actually would try and then it would stop, and then it would try and then stop again. So it's computing some kind of mismatch between what it expected and what it saw. And we found that was actually the only thing that kind of gave rise to like more ethological behavior, one, in this kind of intrinsic way, is what we call 3M progress, model memory mismatch. Also, when optimizing the agent for this objective, actually the internals of the agent predicted the whole brain data of the zebrafish. And they actually predicted a cell that hasn't really been studied as well before, called glia, that are involved in this, thought to be involved in this process. And so that's kind of interesting that it was a kind of an outcome of like here's a goal. We actually want the RL agent to use intrinsic motivation. Here's the AI goal. Intrinsic motivation in a way that's like useful, not weird. And two, as a byproduct, you got this kind of like match to the zebrafish brain up to actually the ceiling that the neuro AI Turing test sets, up to the animal to animal ceiling.
And do you think this goal depends on like different aspects, or this is something that is constant for different, I don't know, stage to fly, different animals, kind of settings?
Yeah, I think these goals can change. And I think one thing we're looking at now is like going across embodiments and also species to see like what is preserved and what isn't. And I think this is very important to do because just like we saw in mouse visual cortex, like until you build the models and compare multiple species brains, you have no idea what's shared and what's different. And I think this is a very useful tool for like looking at evolutionary convergence, but also divergence, which there's bound to be, right? Yeah.
I have a question, I think somewhat related to all of this discussion. By the way, I love the whole questions about like animal brains. I really hope LLMs let me talk to my dog one day, though my wife desperately does not want that. There's work going back to at least 2012, probably before that, about people taking MRIs, I believe, of the brain and then using that to alongside giant databases of images to try to figure out what somebody's looking at without having, direct access to their eyeballs, obviously, like basically trying to see what their brain sees, like brain reading tech. And, you'd be able to, through only an MRI, reconstruct that somebody's looking at like a cross or like a big O or even various types of other, like animals. And I'm just curious as to if you're familiar with that work and how you think it relates to maybe the work that you do, or even the work in the whole field of neuroscience, because that went viral, a decade plus ago, and I know it's only gotten better since.
Right. Yeah. I mean, I think there's some work from Jean-Remy King's group on this too recently. And no, I mean, I think decoding is an essential aspect of like building good brain machine interfaces. So it's going to be critical going forward, and I don't see it going away. The question will just be basically, how do we have better and better recording techniques, especially fMRI or like things in humans that are non-invasive, that allow you to give you a very high fidelity readout or correlation to neural activity, right? So in fMRI, you're not actually getting the spikes, you're getting something that's correlated with elevated spiking activity. And so, which is like the blood oxygen response. And so that there's this question of like, well, kind of building better and better techniques, real hardware, I mean, that allows you to like learn that at high fidelity. Of course, on the other hand, there's the ML, making the ML better as needed. But I actually think it's really more of like a data amount, data quality, and like kind of task you're putting the human or subject in as the critical bottlenecks.
You talked about hardwares. Do you think, I don't know, specific hardwares that based on inspired by the brain, something about spikes and things like that, can be useful for ML?
Yes, that's a good question. Like neuromorphic computing is what you're referring to, I think.
Exactly.
I have always felt, one thing I found interesting has been that from doing lots of these brain model comparisons, a natural question has always been like, well, okay, like what should the observable in the brain be that's like correlated with behavior or intelligence, right? It could be anything. It could have been like mitochondria. It could have been like ion channels concentrations, right? And all this. And maybe in some organisms, like the smaller organisms like C. elegans, like there is some effect of those things, especially because C. elegans doesn't spike. But in like most like mammals, for example, like it actually turns out that lots of times what we're finding is that not just one neuron, but the entire population's firing rates, the rates, not their spikes, but basically the number of spikes in a particular time interval, so the firing rates, which is basically what we're doing with artificial neural networks, right? They're not spiking networks, they're rate-based networks. Those rate, like doing better at predicting those things is correlated with doing better at a task. So it seems like we have like basically strong evidence, at least that's circumstantial, that is saying that like the firing rates are probably the best readout we can think of in mammals for correlating with intelligence. Maybe it's not everything, but it's like quite a substantial part of it. You can always like maybe near the sensory periphery, so like near like sense organs like your ear, etc., where timing differences matter, and that's where spikes can really help you. But I remember actually talking to some neuromorphic folks at EPFL came and visited. Like they were saying that basically they think of it more as like for sensors that are like on device that are just sensing delays, temporal delays like that. Like if you wanted to build like an artificial cochlea, that's where like maybe neuromorphic computing could help. But like for the general like intelligence sort of thing, as you go deeper in cortex, it's like very highly rate based rather than spike timing based. And so I think what we're doing actually now in AI is actually not a bad idea. So very much consistent with that, the sort of things to look at, and then we want to be optimal there. Maybe in practice, like in some cases, you could like constrain, you could do some kind of quantizations or like compile it down to individual spikes, and maybe it'll be more efficient in neuromorphic hardware. But like it's been very hard to build like performance spiking networks. And so maybe what it is that like when it comes to intelligence, it's like much easier to like reason about loss functions and architectures that we optimize, and then we get back firing rate populations, which are correlated with intelligent behavior and firing rates in brains. And then like, so that's kind of like the high level programming language that we have. And then we can like, just like you and I don't reason about the registers, et cetera, of a computer, like you compile that down to spikes and maybe run it on specialized hardware that it might be really good at, but I don't think it's always necessary.
And what about like project, like how much you think we can understand from learning? Until there was a huge project about learning the connections of mice at Princeton, right? Sebastian Song made a huge project about mapping all the connections between neurons. Mice, do you think we can learn from these projects and we can take these projects to, to humans or like to machines or like to use them?
So it depends on like what your goal is. So like, I think if your goal is like a better understanding of the brain, at the end of the day, we want a theory of the brain that goes at all levels, right? Not just the firing rates that are correlated with intelligence, but the connections and the individual cells and cell types and all of that. I think if your goal is intelligence, I don't think it's necessarily needed to like look at the very detailed connectome. If anything, it's like a lot of what we're doing in kind of neuro AI is like really looking at population level aggregates. So not even individual neurons, but just like aggregates of populations. And of course, we're making single neuron predictions, but we're really making predictions across the whole population and looking at representational alignment across that whole population. And so I wouldn't say it's going to be there as like a killer app for intelligence, but maybe for brain machine interfaces, for example, this is going to be very important because, knowing the brain's a real 3D object. And so like when you're going to stick a chip in there, it matters what connects this to what. So like you can't approximate like we do with models. And I think that's where it could be useful. So both maybe for a holistic understanding of the brain at all scales and for BMIs, but probably not for intelligence.
Okay, I think we are out of time. Do you want to add something, plug in, advertising, whatever you want?
Sure. Yeah. I mean, I don't have a book or anything, but, one last thing I'll maybe say is that, one thing we're very much interested in building these autonomous agents is to build them responsibly. And I think something that like academics are very well positioned to do right now is AI safety. One thing I will say is like related to how this connects to intrinsic goals a little bit is I think we need more of a science. I mentioned a science of intelligence, but also more of a science of safety as well. Related to this is like, one thing I can show recently is that scale isn't going to be enough for this. Like you can run into computational barriers to get alignment when you define a formal model of alignment. And even with agents that are computationally unbounded and perfectly rational where you can guarantee alignment, there's barriers. So for example, if there's too many objectives to align over, that's going to be hard already for make it tractable for agents to do so. The like small set of objectives that we can agree on for the most part for agents to have, I think will be a critical next step for circumventing that barrier, but also building more scalably safe systems and having theoretical guarantees about those is going to be important. So I just had some recent work about like humans being in control for like one example of such a small volume set called corrigibility, but there's lots of work to then try to scale that up and do it cost effectively. And how cost-effective alignment will be important for economic implications of, say, wealth distribution, et cetera, as AI continues to grow in its capability. So I think it's important for the next set of questions going forward.
Yeah, safety, like it's very important and huge topic, right? And maybe like if you want, you can come to another episode only for talking on safety, right? It's such an important topic.
Yeah, I would love to. Yeah.
Okay, great. Aran, do you have anything
No,
else?
I have to get going, but I could talk your ear off forever on this topic. It's always a pleasure to speak to brilliant minds like yourself.
Yeah, so Aran, thank you so much that you joined us. It was really, really interesting and really insightful. Thank you, and thank you for the audience.
Thank you so much for having me. Appreciate being on.
Thank you. Bye, everyone.